All right. Well, thank you guys for all gathering. I'm Stefan Roberson. So I'm the director for the Center for Philosophy and Theology at Pacifica Christian High School. So I'm just going to say a couple opening words for introduction and introduce our speaker, Dr. Erika Bachiochi, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jim and Dr. Bachiochi. So we are really excited to have Dr. Erika Bachiochi with us this evening. And actually earlier today, Dr. Bachiochi spoke to a select group of our honors philosophy and theology students, including Isaiah Razavi over there in the corner. So shout out to Isaiah, okay, for coming out tonight. And in that conversation we had with our students, one thing that it was marked by, and I think it's a hallmark of our program, is intellectual hospitality. So our program is committed to, and we want to invite speakers who will challenge our preconceived assumptions and long-held views, and we want to be able to kind of hold this tension as people inviting these guests in, of listening well to them, of clarifying with sincere questions their ideas, and be able to disagree when we can, in a way that honors their ideas and their arguments. And so today I watched as our students interacted with Dr. Bachiochi, and there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement, but there was a lot of great questions and listening and clarifying. And I just get the joy of watching this on a daily basis, and I think it's a hallmark and something that we really hold sacred for our program and at our school. So one of the reasons why we like to have these conversations is because we are also committed to the idea that as humans, we are fallible, right? We get things wrong, and we need kind of our own ideas and reasons checked by outside guests. A further reason is because we believe as Christians that we need to love God with our minds. And so conversations like this, inviting guests in like this, allows us to challenge ourselves and to love God with our minds. So tonight, you will notice that you have these QR codes on these little sheets. During the fireside chat that Jim is having with Dr. Bachiochi, please feel free to scan that QR code and to send in a question that you have for Dr. Bachiochi. At the end of the fireside chat, Father Alex Earl, he will choose some of the best, juiciest, most scandalous questions, and he's going to ask them of Dr. Bachiochi. And so just so you know, you're going to send in the questions. Please include your name with the questions, because actually we want you to ask the question, okay? So don't just leave it anonymous, okay? So with that being said, let me introduce Dr. Erika Bachiochi. So Dr. Erika Bachiochi is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She is a 2024-2025 fellow at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where she is teaching a women's history course at UST's New Catholic Women and Gender Studies program. Dr. Bachiochi is well published. Her essays have appeared in publications such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Christian Bioethics at Oxford University, the New York Times, The Atlantic, Politico, First Things, American Compass, CNN.com, National Review Online, National Affairs, Claremont Review of Books, SCOTUS blog, and Public Discourse, and actually even this morning at the Wall Street Journal. And so it was funny, we were in the office being like, oh, did she just publish something 6 hours ago? We have this person coming in. It's amazing. Like, okay, we were freaking out. Okay.
I'm feeling very underqualified, but it's okay. Yeah. I'm a high school teacher. I'm joking with you.
And also, I think this is especially pertinent to our setting at Pacifica Christian High School. She is also a co-founder of St. Benedict Classical Academy and serves on the board of trustees at Montrose School. And so she is well acquainted with students and working with teenagers. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Erika Bachiochi with us.
Thank you, Stefan. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to thank Dr. Bob and Leslie Hamilton. Bob, are they around here somewhere? They're Bob, thank you, and Leslie back here. So Bob and Leslie have been on the west side of LA for a long time and have been very influential into about these conversations here on the west side of Los Angeles. In fact, they've hosted things like this for decades, and I've been invited to many of those. In fact, they've also let Pacifica and me have things here as well for the school. And so we're just delighted to be back, and thank you for your generosity, your hospitality, and what you've meant to Pacifica and the west side of Los Angeles and to so many for a long time. And people talk about it all the time. So, and you know your influence. So thank you both so much for being here tonight. So Erika, tell me, I just want to first start, thank you for the book. I really enjoyed it in so many levels, and I don't think I absorbed everything, obviously. I want to keep thinking about it. But tell us a little bit about your background and why you wrote the book.
So my background, like my big personal, so
Yeah,
I have a very exciting conversion story.
Sure.
So that's kind of fun. But I won't give all the details. And if you're all on your phones during this, I'll assume that you're asking questions and not really, just like on CNN scrolling or something. So it's really good to be with you all. I've already got to meet Dr. Hamilton. It's a beautiful home. Thank you for welcoming me here. I've had a really fun time here in LA with my friend Mary and all over the place. My story is interesting because perhaps, as I'm actually, one of the things that was not in my bio is I'm actually a mother of 7 children, married for 25 years now. And the reason why that might be interesting, other than the fact that I'm here with you, not with my 7 children, who are ages 23 to 6 and are really, the 6-year-old we don't know about yet, but the rest of them are really quite extraordinary. What's interesting about that in itself is the fact that I was raised by a mom who married and divorced 3 times by the time I reached my 19th birthday. I lost 2 friends to suicide when I was 16 and 18 and got into a whole bunch of trouble when I was a teenager with drugs, alcohol. And so when I was 17, I made my way into Alcoholics Anonymous, and it sort of totally changed my life. That's the short version. I'm sure you all know people for whom Alcoholics Anonymous has changed their life. And so when I got to Middlebury College, where I went to school, small liberal arts college, where actually, Bernie Sanders hails from Vermont, where my school is. So I kind of made my way. I was on the soccer team there. I would make my way to AA meetings, and then I was a women's studies student and was one of the leaders at the Women's Center pretty quickly, and was a Bernie Sanders fan. I, worked for the unionizing effort on campus, was kind of an activist, and really after that second friend died, it sort of, I'd been heading like toward prayer and those kinds of things through AA, but it really I came crashing down and really found myself on my knees in a really profound way. And so I had basically over the next several years, or actually just a few years, and we could get into it, but it would take a lot of the night, a really profound religious conversion. First toward just God as I understand God in a really significant way, got the most hard-ass sponsor I could find, and she worked me, and I worked the steps, and I made amends, and I asked for forgiveness, and I forgave my mom and others in my life, and then began to I just became open suddenly intellectually. And so I went to DC, was profoundly shaped by books I read, one of them by my mentor, who you all probably don't know, but who's this kind of leading legal scholar, Marianne Glendon, at Harvard Law School. And so went from being this kind of activist who thought I knew something about life and what I thought was right and true and good and just, to someone who was really curious, deeply intellectually curious. And so I came back to Middlebury College, and I changed from studying women's studies to studying political philosophy, and just kind of steeped myself in the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, and then had an encounter with Christianity while on campus through my college having a symposium on religion. This very liberal college inviting religious thinkers, and really great, Stanley Hauerwas. Does anybody know who that is? And it was kind of an incredible time. And during all this, I was praying, and I wasn't praying because I was a pious person. I was praying because it was the only way I could get through the day. I was very needed, really, for my sanity. So met the Catholic worker movement through someone who came to campus, and just started sort of, took a class on the New Testament, read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and then, over time, started reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church with a priest, and ended up becoming Catholic, which was where I was baptized when I was an infant, but of course hadn't had any formation. So that's kind of the background of where I came from, kind of this tumultuous time, but also a time that really kind of deeply grounded me, I think, and rooted me in kind of a faith and a real intellectual curiosity that has kind of remained with me for my whole adult life. Nothing really phases me. I'm not a person who is scared of other people's opinions. I really am just very interested. And so one of the things that, there's all sorts of things to say about from that time until now in this book. But I guess the most important thing is just the way in which, while I was studying and writing, especially a lot of my work was in kind of, I guess you could call, if you want to name it, pro-life feminism. So one of the most, so I edited a book called The Cost of Choice, Women Evaluate the Impact of Abortion. I did some law review articles that ended up becoming important, which I didn't know at the time. I was literally reading feminist legal theory and pushing kids in swings, and had no idea that I would make a contribution in constitutional law. And so all of that kind of led me to then want to explore more deeply the foundations of rights. And so this was Marian Glendon's background. And when I was reading more deeply into kind of questions of rights in the law review article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy that did end up making kind of a splash, I'd spent a lot of time with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work. And so I wanted to kind of get behind her account of rights, and then I wanted to kind of compare it with what I understood to be Marian Glendon's account of rights. And it sent me back far, really deep into the literature about women's rights. And I guess, we'll get into sort of the content of the book, but the thing that struck me most, and as you can see, just from telling my personal story, that was kind of running parallel to what I was discovering, is that we have an account in our time that's held by both the left and the right, that feminism, what we call sort of advocacy for women's rights, and the sexual revolution of the 1970s are like hand in glove, that they fit together hand in glove. And so you have the people on the left of our kind of basic political landscape are totally in favor of what they see as this package deal. And then you have the people on the right, especially more and more, that are against the whole package deal. And what I was discovering, and what I saw to be true in my own life, is that there are a lot of really important advances for women. And yet, during that period of the 1970s, advances that I took part in, getting to play sports in college, having advanced degrees, all sorts of other things, I also had, at the same time, the impact of the sexual revolution on my life through the divorces. And so I had this kind of, personal I had the tension of that, what we see as that one revolution in my own life. And so I wanted to try to figure out how could there be all this good and all this ill, and how does it fit together? And so as I went back far into the understanding of sort of women's rights, I came to discover that the earliest women's rights advocates they had a different kind of sexual revolution, a different kind of idea of a sexual revolution that was far more grounded in kind of a Christian understanding, which was that men and women are different, and that instead of sort of, women following sort of the worst sort of men, that we could ask men to kind of, be involved in the family and take really serious their responsibilities as fathers. And so that was an account I read in those earliest women's rights advocates like Mary Wollstonecraft. And so that's sort of how I got to going from what I thought was going to be one book to something that became a very different book.
Yeah, I was struck by Marian Glendon. I hadn't known her before until I read the book, and how she's trying to kind of put the Mary Wollstonecraft lens on our current day. So tell us, so that's how you came to the book, and I'm glad you went back and looked at all that stuff. Tell us a little the overall thesis of the book first, and then we can get into some of the details.
Yeah. So just to clarify, Marian Glendon is actually not doing the work of putting Wollstonecraft back in. So she is just kind of a thinker in her own right, who I see
as doing that. Okay,
as doing that. Yeah. So the basic thesis of the book is that there's these two strains, these two different accounts of women's rights, and one is very deeply tied to rights in order to carry out responsibilities. That rights, that freedom itself has an end, and that end is excellence, and that end is achieved through virtuously carrying out our responsibilities to other, and that's what makes a flourishing life. And so there's an account of excellence, that we have the capacity to be excellent human beings, that there's something that is an excellent human being, and that we ought to strive for it, and rights give us the freedom to do so. And that's what I see as the Wollstonecraft strain that is very deeply informed by Christianity. And I draw out that strain and how it was, the first two chapters give an account of Wollstonecraft's understanding of rights and duties and virtue, and her account of motherhood and fatherhood and the importance of those, and the importance of the cultivation of virtue in the home and that teachers do, that is very different from how we think of feminism today, And so then I show how her account had a lot of influence on the earliest women's rights advocates in our country, those in the mid-19th century, who, in my mind, we don't understand that time as well as we should. That was also highly influenced by Christianity, because if you think about how that history has been told, it's through the 1970s feminists who have basically memory holed all the religious thinkers and pulled out the ones that fit that agenda best. So we hear about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the most radical of those. She was still pro-motherhood, pro-life, but just was more radical on things like divorce and other kinds of things. And then you have a different strain. So follow that strain, and I then see the strain. I kind of see parts of it going through, the FDR period, right, and kind of tensions there. And then, sort of parts, Friedan, there's a little bit, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg a little bit, and then I see it come into its culmination in Marianne Glendon. And the argument is that had we followed this strain, we would have ended up with a kind of feminism like that promoted by Marianne Glendon, which is totally, sees the family as the sort of foundation for society. For both men and women, and that it's the place where virtues are cultivated. It's the place on which all economic goods, all civic goods, all political goods rest. And so if we're not doing a good job there, we're not going to have public virtue, right? The other strain that's competing with this strain that comes up a little later after Wollstonecraft is through John Stuart Mill, and then which is what we would call a libertarian strain, right? So it's freedom without an end. It's sort of freedom for its own sake that kind of is determined however one might want. And so it goes up through Stanton, and then there's different parts of Friedan and different parts of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I see as ultimately kind of the beneficiary of, or the ultimate end of this strain. I mean, you could see the strain even go further into what we have now in terms of freedom eating away at its own self, through, I would say, in transgender ideology and things like that. So that's kind of the basic thing. I'm giving you sort of the big names that we can sort of now, I think, possibly break down.
So tell me a little bit more about the Wollstonecraft strain, and it's rooted in religion. I think at some point you talk about John Paul II and his book, The Theology of the Body. Mm-hmm. So talk about the grounding, I think, in Genesis, and where she comes, what that means versus the Mill side. Flesh out a little bit more.
Yeah. So actually, John Paul II, I don't think comes up in this book at all, but he is who I wrote about in the Wall Street Journal. Who's was influential on Marianne Glendon and myself too. And so all of the thinkers from Wollstonecraft to these early women's rights advocates, they grounded equality in the Imago Dei, right? In the reality, the Christian reality, the Christian belief that we're made in the image of God, that both men and women are rational creatures, that both men and women are responsible to God for their lives, and that they are also, and this was kind of a big theme of hers, is that against, calling upon the virtue ethics of Aristotle, she was, not in favor of the idea that there are feminine virtues and there are masculine virtues. She saw that human beings are human beings with human souls, and that each human being, in order to be fully human, ought to cultivate all the virtues. So I don't know how well people know the tradition of, in sort of basic Western tradition, bit different from Christianity itself, but that there's sort of like the ruling virtues, which are male virtues, and the kind of obedience virtues, which are the female virtues. And so she wanted to see men be chaste, for instance, and women be courageous. And she thought that that was necessary in order to not only be citizens and things like that, like equal citizenship, but way before that. For women to be able to be good wives and mothers, they needed to be courageous. They needed to be strong. She said, meek women make foolish mothers. As a mother of 7, I think that's probably true. Although meek not taken in the Christian sense, that's a nice, but we have to be strong. And so how do you find that strength is not by being treated as kind of the playthings of men and not being educated, but by being educated and by being formed morally. And mostly for her, by knowing what your end is. And so for her, the end is eternity. And so that's who you owe your self to, and that's who you ought to be most curious about what God's opinion of you is, and not what the
So it seems like there's
is.
this eternal focus versus the
That's right.
materialist focus
That's
on
right.
both strains.
Yep.
And so rooting it in Genesis,
Yeah.
the purpose is not just now, it's eternal,
right.
and you're focused on
That's
that.
right.
And then I like Rousseau talking to her, or the
Yeah.
conversation about the male virtues,
Yeah.
and she rejected that.
Yeah.
And that definitely affects like how you view education a little
Yeah.
bit too, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Rousseau was her big sort of interlocutor in A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And so if you don't know Rousseau well, his Emile he has a 5th chapter where he's talking about the education of Sophie.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an education that is made, you educate the woman to please the man. All of her education is for him in some sense, right? And so because, she'll be an educator of sons or she'll be an educator of daughters, but it's for the purpose of ensuring kind of that the man has freedom and autonomy, right? So she's like entirely his helpmate to such an extent that she doesn't attain sort of the human virtues herself.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about that with the European aristocracy, women who are just kind of, what's their purpose?
Yeah.
Versus in America, it's a little bit different.
Yeah,
So.
right. Yeah, that's right. So she was pretty hard on their sort of aristocratic, semblances, like ideas, like we, care about virtue, but really we're most interested in kind of, looking at how we appear to others, and that, and sort of honors and riches and all that, and that the poorer classes were just imitating those same materialistic virtues. So her argument at that point, I mean, she is, interested in sees the French monarchy as corrupt in her time, and she's looking specifically at the fact that they are not, basically forming their citizenry well. And so it's no wonder to her when in the French Revolution it all goes berserk because you haven't formed the poor well, and so they're going to act like animals because you've treated them like animals.
Yeah, women weren't given a chance for moral excellence like she talks about, is rooted in Genesis.
Yeah.
That's good. Talk a little bit about some of the vocabulary that you bring up.
Yeah.
Male chastity or chastity,
Yeah.
Sexual asymmetry,
Yeah.
voluntary motherhood. Just kind of talk about some of those terms and how it relates.
Yeah. So a key theme of the book is just the basic belief that, basic judgment on my part that comes out of other prior work I'd done to this, that basically what I call sexual asymmetry, it's not a term that I coined, it comes out of sort of evolutionary biology, is at the heart of the feminist question. So basically all different strains of feminism, and I define feminism very simply, it's just advocacy for women, there's distinctive needs and kind of interest rights of women. And there are all sorts of different feminisms. Why? Because each of those words is contested. What is a woman? What is the end of a woman? What is advocacy? What are rights? There's 2 different accounts of rights that I'm presenting, right? And so, asymmetry is this idea that's very basic to the human experience that was observed by Aristotle, observed by all of us, which is that, and I think Aristotle kind of puts it best, that women reproduce inside ourselves and men reproduce outside themselves. And so this is just like a basic asymmetry or inequality with regard to reproduction. And how do you solve that? And so feminism is trying to ask, like, what do you do about this? So in a lot of traditional societies, and for Aristotle himself, it's kind of like, well, women do the childbearing, and for Aristotle, and they, their reason doesn't have the kind of authority a man does. And so they just take care of that. And we have, a tradition of kind of separate spheres where women take care of all the childbearing, and that's what they're made for. That's their function, right? Becomes, in certain times, especially sort of during, medieval, medieval times where there's lots of kind of farms and the households grow big and all that, there's a deep collaboration between men and women. And so the fact that like women are the ones that have the babies, it doesn't matter so much in the sense that there's kind of an equality that's existential. It's like there's a collaboration, there's an interdependency that's just basic to like having to live with one another on a farm. Think of like, I'm reading now Little House on the Prairie to my daughter, and it's like the highly skilled work of both Pa and Ma. Pa was doing really highly skilled work of strength, and Ma was doing like really highly skilled work inside the home, right? With like making the butter and all these kinds of things. Just the agrarian lifestyle was like highly skilled on both sides. And so you think about prior to the industrial revolution, 90% of all of our textiles, all clothing was made in the home by women mainly. At the loom. And what is the loom? The loom is kind of off the floor. Children are playing underfoot. You're doing your work while you're tending to children. It's all kind of a piece. When the boys get old enough, they go outside and start to get, strong with their dads and get mentored by him. And the girls stay in and are mentored. And this is just like the, warp and woof of life, if that's the expression, in this time. Well, then industrialization comes, right? And that interdependency that was just so basic to life has sort of there's still interdependency, but the problem is cash is introduced, right? And wages are introduced, and men go out of the home, often not of their own accord. They're like forced out to go into, the factories, because now there's factories that are making food and other things that they were trading and all that. And there becomes what had been this economic interdependency where the home was the household. So, economics is household management, right? It's economia. If you're the Greek, you can say that better than me, but that's the management of the household, right? And so suddenly economics gets pulled out of the home, where the wife was like managing all of it, pulled out of the home. Politics is out of the home, and the wife is sort of left like with the kids, but with this kind of deep dependency on the man. Because now she's still making all the clothes and things like that, but as the industrial revolution wears on, the looms are now they become industrial looms, and her highly skilled work is done by machines. And so the dependency becomes really intense. And so what happens when men are out in the cities that are the sprawling cities, and they're being, potentially exploited by their by the industrial. We know the stories about what the factories were like. They don't have their own ownership of their own work that they had. These might not be the same men, but it's still pretty alienating. They're away from their homes, they're away from their wives, they're away from their children. They've lost their place in some sense. And there's bars, and there's brothels, and there's prostitutes, because those women had been, like in a former time, part of the household. Yeah, single women. There are a lot of single women all the time in history. Not all women are married, right? But those women had been brought into households and worked in households and with families. And so now they're available for men who now are far from their wives. And so what is the first thing that happens in the mid-19th century with, the Second Great Awakening, religiosity of women, way more women in churches than men, the temperance movement, right? Women saying like, hey, there's drinking and there's beating of women that's going on. And there's women who come out of that who become very interested in abolition. In particular, two women, the Grimke sisters, come out from the south, come to the north, and start talking about, the Imago Dei in Genesis, and talking about the need to, abolish slavery, but then also are really, upset with the treatment of women. And so that's sort of the nature of what's happening. But the response to sexual asymmetry at that time is that, hold on, like there had been this interdependence. It had sort of worked out at that time, but now there's this deep dependency, and women are can be left alone. And so that legal arrangement that had kind of predated the Industrial Revolution wasn't going to work so well anymore. And so there starts to be an interest among these women who are becoming more highly educated to at least have joint property rights, to have the rights so that it wasn't just their husband who was going to own the everything that comes into the family. He owns it. It's under his name as a liberal individual, but that maybe, they should share and have the rights as joint property owners. This comes to pass in 1970 that we, finally have joint property rights. Louisiana is an outlier, always have joint property rights. But it basically is recovering a medieval form of common property ownership, because prior to liberalism, we don't have, individuals. We have families who are owning kind of their rights run with the land. And so, sorry, I'm getting really into the weeds, but the land comes through the mother's line or comes through the father's line, and then you have it together. But then there's a switch in the late medieval period that goes in, that becomes primogeniture. It's through that oldest son, right? And so everything becomes like male focused, and so women are just becoming more and more dependent. And so then how do you deal with sexual asymmetry then, And so out of that comes women's voices, Christian women's voices, who are calling upon chastity for men. Mm-hmm. And just like Christianity blasting into pagan times, where for anyone who, actually there's a great book out called Women and Children, Mothers and Children, I think, about sort of women in sort of ancient times and the treatment of women and the treatment of children, the sort of infanticide, exposing infants, was Christianity blasts in and says, hold on, like monogamous marriage, chastity for men, like this is something that elevates women. But it wasn't, there weren't sort of rights that came along back, it took a long time. And so with industrialization, there's more of a push for it. And those women start to articulate a different kind of, very Christian understanding of how to answer sexual asymmetry. Voluntary motherhood is another one. So one of the calls they make, so joint property ownership is the first thing. They want common ownership. The second is what they call voluntary motherhood, which made us, and some, pro-choice scholars will say, oh, voluntary motherhood, that was from that. But then when you actually see what they mean, being free to engage in that act that might make one a mother, which is sex. So why would they need the freedom to engage in sex? Well, because in that understanding where like husband and wife become one flesh, it's assumed that it means, and this is, that the husband possesses the wife and so can have her whenever he pleases. And so along this, with the sort of, you can imagine if they're calling for temperance and they're, having a hard time with the fact that that their husbands are drinking a lot, what goes with that is also some forcing of men themselves on their wives. So a lot of their opposition to abortion at that time is the sense that, and the belief that that meant that like having this out of abortion was allowing men to request sex more, and so that they kind of said, no, we want chastity, and no, we need to basically have a say in when we engage in that act that will make one a mother. And so that becomes sort of a sense of, they have the saying of votes for women, chastity for men becomes like a slogan. And so chastity is at the core of the early women's rights movement, which is obviously a very different kind, as I mentioned, of sexual revolution than when we see much later.
I'm just curious, so we don't hear that today.
Chastity, the word?
Male chastity.
Oh, yeah.
So talk about like...
We don't hear chastity at all.
We don't hear chastity. We certainly don't hear male chastity. So talk about, I want to jump to that for a second.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not today? What's the...
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a pretty important solution.
Yeah, it does seem like an important solution. Because it's hard.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. Yeah, no, I think because, it's interesting because after the sexual revolution, so think about what the sexual revolution does, is it's the solution it offers instead. And I'll tell you, after, I remember being down at LSU, Louisiana State University, and doing a presentation on this book. And I had a professor say to me, I think what you say is compelling. But the problem is that those first wave feminists, and this is a basic second wave feminist argument, they were naive. Men can't be chaste. And I was like, I disagree with you, because I know a whole bunch of men who are gentlemen. And I think it was giving up on men. It was giving up on the idea that we could ask that of men. And why is that? There's a reason for it. It's not just, this despair, and women didn't know the men, didn't know any good men or something like that, because Margaret Sanger intervenes. So Margaret Sanger in the 1920s says, I'm looking around and all these solutions you women's rights advocates have come up with, property ownership, expecting your guys to be chaste, other property, contract rights, eventually the vote. That's all. She calls them palliatives. Those are Band-Aids. We need to get to the heart of the matter, the heart of sexual asymmetry, right? Is women's fertile bodies. That's the problem. And so her solution to asymmetry is technological, right? And so with the intervention of the pill, which, she has, over the course of I think a decade or more, there's sort of experiments on Haitian women. There's all sorts of, Margaret Sanger, there's a couple interesting things to say about her. I mean, one is that she's interested in kind of a sexual libertarianism that there were fringe movements early on that were interested in kind of like liberating sexuality. But she also is a nurse, and she's seeing a lot of like bad, sad women who are having, baby after baby after baby. And she's trying to figure out a lot of poor women. Women are writing her letters about how difficult their lives are because they, I just had my 6th child and my husband has left me, or my husband is drunk, or it's so difficult. So she's hearing all this, right? And then, so there's sort of like a lot of different elements. There's the eugenic element that's there that has been more explored recently. And in some of her language, you really see like we don't, we're interested in, the pill and contraception. We don't want rich women to get it. We want rich women to have babies because they'll have good babies. We don't want poor women to have it. So we're going to, find ways to get it in poor people's hands. Of course, it got into the rich women's hands and not into the poor women's hands. And so they had to force it on poor women. But what happens with the pill that's so, fascinating, kind of heartbreaking in a way, is that it was seen as this like answer to the problem of sexual asymmetry. Like if we can just suppress fertility, then women can be as free as men to engage in the pleasures of sex, right? And she really saw it as a prophylactic against abortion. She saw it as like, we don't, like, abortion is no good, like that, there's even like a Planned Parenthood, her organization, which she founded, there was a handbill really early on in the beginning. It said, abortion ends lives. We need to prevent them coming to. So like, it was very clear they knew what it was, and she thought it was a bad thing. And so she wanted to prevent it. So it's like, this is a good solution, obviously, right? But the problem is like, if you today, and at school I sort of showed, I usually have a chart that I can put up on a slide, but that if you go and Google like out of wedlock childbearing, in the 1960s, so right before the pill, 5% out of wedlock childbearing. 5% of babies are born outside of marriage. 40% in African American families. This is in 1960. By 1970, it's 40% of all families, and then 70% of African American families. And it makes sense when I actually had one of your very smart children define for me what a moral hazard is. And if one of them can, I suspect anybody here probably can. But just this idea, and she did it so well, probably better than I'm going to be able to right now, is basically like when you use technology to solve a problem, you kind of, the habits that you had, those virtues that you had for being able to, contend with that sort of human appetite, those sort of habits recede, right? And so then you are left with sexual, appetites with no habits, what we used to call chastity, right? Which is kind of the integration of our sexual appetites into our, like, the fullness of the person. And so with what happens is you basically have an increase. So contraception comes in, American women like gobble it up. I mean, it is like the FDA barely approves it in 1960, and it is like, everybody wants it. It's like the solution, this is gonna be great. The problem is that because of that moral hazard, there's this idea, we can just engage in sex more, and there's more sexual risk-taking is the best way to put it, right? So people are like, oh, we don't need to be, married because I'm not gonna get pregnant. We don't need to worry about that. And then, of course, contraception isn't foolproof. And so there are all sorts of, what we thought was going to be the prophylactic against abortion becomes something that people then say, oh, well, now we need abortion because there's all of these new pregnancies, especially outside of marriage. And so then it becomes, now we need abortion. And so that becomes, through Margaret Sanger, the technological solution through contraception and abortion. And then we can just add on all of the ways technology has become the way we think about how to solve this problem of asymmetry, right? So from fake wombs, also surrogacy, there's all sorts of ways technology becomes the way. And that is how the 1960s, starting with Simone de Beauvoir, 1950, but then 60s, 70s, that's how they conceive of the solution to the problem, is through technology.
So it's not a moral solution, it's
not
a
a moral
technological solution. And the idea of out-of-wedlock sex, I'm sure the guys love that. I'm sure that was like kind of the male version of the sexual dream. It was like having sex whenever you want with whoever you want. And it felt like maybe women were going along with all that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So let me try to sum up where we've kind of been. So pre-industrial revolution, there's an interdependence. The home is a very important place for formation, for the best of men and women. That's what's happening. And Mary Wollstonecraft would argue that the home is where virtue is inculcated.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And then you get the industrial revolution, technology, right? And it forces people out of the home. And it really makes women more dependent. And it gets kind of scary with alcohol and those type of things, brothels. And then you get the legal movement to try to help protect that. And I was interested just briefly, I know we don't have a ton of time, but like the difference between Florence Kelly and Alice Paul's arguments. So it brought me back to my days at UCLA when I studied the progressive era and the whole, I was in the Powell Library just reading all these cases. And Florence Kelly's talking about protective legislation, and then Alice Paul's talking about strict equality. Maybe just briefly talk about that.
Yeah. So this was a really fun, this is chapter 5 of the book. It's with my legal background, it was the most interesting chapter probably to write. I really found it fascinating. Any lawyers in here? No lawyers.
Wow.
You guys don't have lawyers in LA?
Yeah,
it's all lawyers in Boston.
We're so virtuous, we don't need lawyers.
So without going into, what was fun about this is that you read all these progressive era court cases, Lochner, anybody know Lochner? All these, okay, so anyway, there were all these women behind these cases, and I had no idea there were these internal debates among sort of labor advocates and strict equality feminists and all these, so this is and actually there's an essay I wrote in National Affairs, which because of the debate around the ERA, this is the debate that those two women were having. Florence Kelly, who was kind of worried about sort of the conditions of industrial workplace, the practical realities for women, and the fact that women were pulled into the workplace. It's funny, some of the students today were concerned with women, wanting to choose to work, which makes sense in our day, where there are nice offices and, I don't know, medical offices, things like that, where you can go and have and it's well, I don't know how many of those women really wanted to work, they were being pushed into mainly into the workforce. Although obviously, some single women might have been more interested, but when you're literally leaving your family to have to go and work, it's a different kind of scenario. So Florence Kelly, Alice Paul debating the ERA, because Alice Paul, right after in 1920, she's like, okay, what's next? Equal Rights Amendment, we got to get equality into the Constitution. And so there's a debate that is very familiar to us right now. It was just about how do we think about human beings? Do we think of them, in particular, thinking about women, as relational, as members of families, as having responsibilities and obligations to others, and especially their children? Do we try to accommodate those kinds of responsibilities they have in the workplace? Or that's the Florence Kelly version. And she wanted, part of it is protecting women so they don't have to work too many hours, those kinds of things. And then Alice Paul was strict equality. She was the ERA, and they would just debate back and forth. And Alice Paul never got her way and still hasn't. But Alice Paul was very pro-life woman. There's all sorts of other ways in which she would be a conservative to in some of our minds today, but a very strict equality thinker. So yeah, that was a debate that
and
that went
correct
on.
me if I'm wrong. The Alice Paul strain basically was more aspirational.
That's right.
And the Florence Kelly strain was much more pragmatic in the sense of we got to do something today, the half a loaf thing that you talk about, and the wedge issue. let's fix this for now,
Yeah,
kind of thing,
that's
versus
right.
Alice Paul getting,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I think what Florence Kelly would say is we need specific bills for specific ills.
Right.
Like, let's solve this problem rather than like we can just have this idea of men and women being entirely perfectly equal, and it'll be the children will be fine, you know. And I think we see that sometimes when there's like this idea of like flattening of sex differences, and if we just ignore them, they'll just go away. You know, we'll just kind of tuck like abortion over here, and then we'll just like use abortion to deal with the inequalities and the mess. But then, I mean, one of the main arguments of the book, by the time you get to chapter 8, is like when abortion becomes the center of the solution for asymmetry, well, what happens when women want to have children? Then what? The workplace hasn't accommodated it at all, right? And so then we're just relying on abortion instead of actually taking serious sexual asymmetry, taking seriously that women are rational creatures who, you know, contribute in different ways, but also are the ones who bear children. And isn't that awesome? You know? And so not to say that like every workplace is going to perfectly accommodate a woman with a whole bunch of children, you know, but like we haven't even begun to think about it because we have this little thing over here where we can just...
the market force conversation is something we should have in a minute too. The last thing between Paul and Kelly a little bit, it just reminded me a little bit of the conversation between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, like Booker T. being much more pragmatic and practical, we got to do this now, and Du Bois being much more aspirational. And the letters between the two of them and the arguments between Paul and Kelly, it was interesting to think about that. Let's talk about the 60s and the sexual revolution a little bit, market forces. So eventually abortion, the pill that Sanger produces and puts into play, is the solution, and then we have abortion. So talk about the sexual revolution and abortion, and, you know.
Yeah, what else is there? What more is there to say? I mean, it's sort of the way we kind of think about. It's when, you know, so I see what I show is like there's a real women's movement that is really interested in rights as necessary to carry out duties, obligations, rights and duties very much joined together that predates the sexual revolution. So we often think like feminism starts in 1960, 1970, right? And it's like, that's when those two are very much merged together. But you can even separate them, you know, I mean, I think, and one of the arguments I make in the book, and I'm a fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's early anti-discrimination work, you know, her basically saying like, you know, you shouldn't think of, so it's you know, in the early 1970s, and she's an ACLU attorney, and she's basically like, we shouldn't kind of think of women as just potential mothers, as a class of potential mothers. We ought to think about them as individuals. She's making an Alice Paul argument, however, she's doing it kind of one woman at a time, right? And so like, if there is a woman who has the capacity to do such and such a job, we, you know, should consider her for that job and not just like keep her out because she's a woman of the class of people who has babies. And I think Wollstonecraft would agree with the idea that women are rational creatures, not just have the function of childbearing. Yeah, that's right. So the problem with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in my view, is that there's a tension to me that's very clear between this idea of anti-discrimination law and then having abortion be the solution for asymmetry. And so I spell out that tension. So chapter 7 is about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's kind of anti-discrimination work, and then I kind of reveal what I think is this tension, which is this idea that if you are, you know, thinking about, you know, I mean, how to put this in the easiest way, but if you're thinking about equality in sort of a male orientation, like in order to come into the market, I have to sort of enter the market on the market's terms as it is. Then, you know, and I don't kind of bring my, you know, childbearing capacity with me as a woman. I kind of am able to somehow keep that away. And I have abortion, and that abortion is necessary for women's equality, that it just ends up so that we just have a place where, you know, we have kind of women and children over there, and then we have anybody else who can be kind of autonomous in the market. And so I think it dehumanizes us, like the market becomes a place and you start to see feminism aim for what I call market equality instead of moral equality. It's aiming for market equality. Everything ends up being, you know, the other kind of key part is like prior to the industrialization, you see the home is very productive. After the Industrial Revolution, you see the home is consumptive. And so everything in the family becomes about getting the kind of money you need
Yeah, Friedan
to
talks
be able
about
to.
that with
Yeah.
the cult of domesticity and the
Yeah.
boredom factor with the technology, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like the home is not,
Yeah.
it's just, you get your
Right.
work done by noon and what do you do?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
like-
right, yeah. Yeah, so it's like, how do you, right, the kind of great productive labors that were in the home have gone out. And so what do you do in the home? Like if you're a woman who has all sorts of capacities, like, you know, you could have a lot of kids, that's one possibility. But then, you know, so I think the kind of question of like, how do we think about a society that really values both men and women and all their capacities and their different interests and their different talents, but sees them as having this asymmetry at the core of their relationship. And those are the kinds of questions that I think Ginsburg does not solve in her work by having anti-discrimination law. Yes, women have opportunities just like men, but we just have abortion. And it's not to say she didn't want other solutions too, but the core, by making abortion the core solution, I think it derails what sort of the movement was after, which is really trying to see woman as fully human, right? Even as women who, you know, even as those who carry children. Yeah.
That's good. Let's talk about the chapter 10 for a second. The solution, the vision for the future.
Yeah.
So maybe dig into that a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, there's all sorts of things to say in chapter 10. So that's sort of my, chapter 9 is devoted to Marian Glendon, like how I see.
Oh, we can go back and talk about
Yeah,
her.
well, that's okay.
I'm
That's,
fascinated by her too
yeah,
as well.
yeah. So, I mean, there's so much, we're getting into the weeds a lot, so I'm not sure how interested people's interest is maybe, you know, declining here, but, so chapter 10 is.
You have this so
Yeah.
there's two quotes, two things that struck me. One is,
tell me.
I think in chapter 9, you mentioned that Wollstonecraft and Glendon, they're radical and feminists. They're not radical feminists.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that just a little bit more? I mean, I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, someone called Marian Glendon a radical, a radical and a feminist, but not a radical feminist.
Right.
Yeah. So what does that mean for Marian Glendon? So Glendon's work, so she was like the highest ranking woman in the Catholic Church because she was, you know, she was on the, she just actually, she's now in her 80s, still a dear mentor, now friend, who's in the Boston area. And she actually just came out with a book from Random House called In the Court of Three Popes, where she talks about her work in the church. But her work is also in comparative law and family law, and she really had a deep impact on kind of the political conversation in like the 80s and the 90s. She was looked at by both, I think, the Carter and the Reagan administrations, which is kind of extraordinary to be put on like into a court, you know, to become a judge, and she was just interested in being a scholar, so that didn't happen. So she's really like a very, very important figure, especially, you know, years ago. And so a radical, I mean, getting into like what is a radical feminist would be a lot, but she was a radical because, and I think this is true of Wollstonecraft too, is that radical is obviously going to the roots, right? And so she wanted to go to the roots of the human, just what it is to be human. And she wanted something like a humane economy that wasn't like thinking about sort of, you know, obviously free market is fine, but just wasn't like capitalistic, that was fully consumed with consumption, right? And that obviously wasn't like socialistic, but that had the human at the heart of it. And both of them saw the family and the inculcation of virtue in the family as being that which enables like, you know, all else to function. And so I think that both of them too, and I talk about this at the very beginning of the book, they both suffered from a lot of loss with regard to men. So Marian Glendon, who, you know, has 3 grown children, had a wonderful, long marriage, second marriage, but her first husband left her. And so that was like a profound difficulty as being a single mother. And that was like sort of really kind of deeply informed, I think, a lot of her work on dependency, on vulnerability, on, you know, the fact of this being at the heart of the human experience and that we kind of all need each other in solidarity. I mean, that was like a big sort of focus of hers, yeah.
So then how do we reconcile the home with the market forces? Talk about chapter 10 then a little bit more.
Yeah, chapter 10.
And I wrote a note there, you said new feminism, women as women, rights linked to responsibility.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I do in chapter 10, I mean, there is some section about like policy ideas and those kind of things, but I think the really most important thing what this book is doing is saying that as Americans, we think a lot about excellence, but not about human excellence. So we think about like there are excellent athletes and there are excellent movie stars out here, and there are excellent poets and there are excellent, well, we don't think about poets very much in this country, but excellent excellent musicians. And we have a sense of excellence. Like we see it, we know it, but we don't want to talk about human excellence. Like we don't want to say that there's a way to be an excellent human being. And I think that's unfortunate, you know, and I think it's unfortunate because we really need some excellent human beings around. Because we're, you know, you think about the failure in nearly every institution we have. I mean, from banks to government to churches to, on and on and on. And at the core of all these failures is broken human beings, right? Broken human beings who I think we don't have a sense that human beings are capable of excellence. And so it's kind of like this aspirational like sense of what it is to be excellent, in my view, in my account, is basically to carry out, it's Wollstonecraft's account, it's to carry out our obligations to others virtuously, you know, with virtue. And that what it is, the project of our political economy is to, and our legal system, all of it is to provide the conditions for each of us in our own spheres to carry out those responsibilities. And that, you know, we think about like the common good, and sometimes people get scared. They're like, what's the common good? The government's going to come and say, this is the common good. And my view of the common good is like, no, if each of us understood what it is, what are our obligations in all of our different spheres, and we just work to carry those out, then that would be living out the common good together, right? And that there would be a way in which, if you could imagine us saying, what are the conditions that make possible that? So what are the conditions that make possible a family to be able to carry out their duties to one another? And to think more in terms of that. So like the book is The Rights of Women. The book is deeply concerned with the responsibilities and flipping it. So like a lot of times when I'm talking about this really contentious issue of abortion, you can hear me on Ezra Klein, the Ezra Klein show in the New York Times, flipping it and saying like, we have these, and this is, I learned from Marian Glennon, is like, instead of talking about the rights of the woman and the rights of the unborn child clashing, like let's talk about our duties of care.
Yeah, that's in the book
care?
a lot, and I find that at Pacifica, we talk about duties of care and responsibilities.
That's right.
Getting it from my father-in-law, who served in World War II, who focused on his responsibilities,
That's right.
not his rights, really.
That's right.
His rights were part of it, but it was really about his responsibilities. And we live in a society, especially in West LA, that's focused on autonomy, individualism, and what's good for me, and not how we can pursue the common good necessarily, and how we can pursue our responsibilities. So I thought it was fascinating. I think that's the way forward in a lot of ways, is that produce people who are excellent human beings, who are focused on their duties of care. And especially, I like how at the end of our talk today with the kids, it was kind of fun. You challenged the guys, and one of the solutions was male chastity, and like, you said something about punishing men. I thought that was very funny, about like, let's have a higher call for the men. It's not just all on women here, the men to do what men should do. And the Christian worldview talks about that. Let's do it well. So I like to call it excellence. I like to call it interdependence. In fact, I was just talking to folks after your talk today after at the school. When I walk on the private school campuses in West LA, I feel the autonomous thing going on. I feel the independence. And what we talk about at our school is interdependence, and what our like love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, love your neighbor as yourself. That's what we talk about. And you can palpably feel it, I think, on our campus. Whereas other campuses, you're like, this is just to produce these kids that just are on their own islands, basically.
And lonely.
And lonely,
very lonely.
Yeah. So I think that's the time, right? So now we get the fun part of questions, where you guys get to pick up. We just scratched the surface of it. Thank you for that, by the way. Really, really powerful and good. I don't know how many people have read the book. I got the benefit of reading the entire book. I'm going to go back and read it again because it was a good.
It was a bit in the weeds there, so hopefully there was enough that you guys could chew on. Yeah.
So, Alex, do you want to come do the question and answer? You can kind of come over wherever you want. Yeah.
I've memorized these questions, so they're not mine. I'm not hoodwinking you.
But you can ask the question too.
So one question, the initial question, is the Republican Party has often been thought of as the pro-life party.
Yeah.
And so what do you make of this additional rise, whatever, Republican, right, alt-right, however you can put it, people like Andrew Tate, this whole new
What do I
wave
think
of
of
people
Andrew
that seem
Tate?
to not be very
Yeah.
pro-life.
Or like Elon Musk, who is not really
Republican?
about family,
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah.
Like he's got many children, many different
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Genghis Khan. That's the new.
Right. Yeah.
The new model of
Yeah.
manhood
Yeah.
is Genghis, rich men having many children from many different women.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do I think about it?
Yeah. That's the question.
Yeah.
What's your response to it?
So I think it's really there's something. I think about how wonderful my husband is and how blessed I am, to have this man for 25 years of my life. After, like, you heard the story, like, how did this happen? How do I get to be married for 25 years? This amazing man. And just think of, like, why can't he be a model of manhood for people, right? Like, why, and I'm sure all the men in this room. Well, why? Because you're out busy doing the things that men do, which is not going on social media and, like, showing all your women and your cars, right? Even if you have nice cars, right? You're doing the job that men do, which is like take care of people, right? Work hard, sacrifice for others, put their families first, And so, like, we don't have those models out there because social media has given us these other models. And so, I think there's a lot that's where men, in particular, like working class men, we've focused a ton in our country on college for the last, 30, 40 years, I'm not sure how long. And, the noble work of working with your hands in the trades is not seen, I guess, by men as noble as it once was. The great kind of profession you can have there. And so there's just there's a lot of men who are out of work, who are lonely, who are, porn addicts, because there's like porn everywhere. It's like all over the internet. And so I think, like, we're in a time where we're not holding up standards for men. We don't have models, right? We have athletes, we have, and male chastity isn't even on, it's not even on the radar. It's not even, I was hoping, my hope for President Obama was like, okay, here's this African-American, man, and he loves his wife and he loves his girls and he's going to come and be a model for man. And I'm not sure that that's what happened, right? So we don't have a lot of that. And I think, I don't even know how, we used to have television shows where men were depicted the way men are. And now we have television shows where men are falling all over themselves and women are the heroes in every single show. And it's like, well, then how do you think men aren't going to have role models? Because we never depict them as the men we know are, right? The good men we know are. And so I think the work of parents and schools, I have 3 sons. This is I love my boys. I love the boys in the class today. They were, just tons of energy, trying to figure it all out and making mistakes along the way, right? And so, yeah, what do I think of Andrew Tate? I think it's kind of the worst possible thing that could be happening right now. The sad thing, and this is what my Wall Street Journal article is about, is that there's some Catholics who think Andrew Tate is just awesome. Wow. They just don't want to have all the women. They just want to really subject their own wives in their homes to sort of this, it's, because their view is that men are, the line that I quote is that Andrew Tate gets 90% right. What does he get right? He gets right that men are the superior sex. This is this Catholic view of these kind of far right, So, and all of this is pushing the sexes further and further apart. Yeah. So I guess that's my long view on, Andrew Tate.
Good. The second one, I'll take a little creative liberty just to increase it. So a lot of your account is about, let's say, early feminist rootedness in Genesis and the Imago Dei. But you have this passage from 1 Timothy 2, that asks women, I permit no women to speak, they're to remain silent. Remember, Eve was taken from Adam, a woman is saved through childbearing, the rough version of this passage. So what does this passage of the scriptures, how does that bear on the role of women in the church? It's a tough one for Roman Catholics and Orthodox. So.
Well, Is it though?
Maybe.
I mean, we don't have women priests.
That's
so
right. That's usually where it comes
yeah,
up
yeah,
in these, some of these.
Yeah, so I have to say that I am a legal scholar
Yeah.
and not a scripture scholar.
Mm.
So what I would say, I mean, I can say something about the relation between men and women in marriage. I can't say so much about ecclesial structures. I just think it would be irresponsible for me to answer that. I think that in the churches that, like the Catholic Church, we don't have, the roles we have for women are advisory roles at, sort of theologians at, like a Marian Glendon, who's not a theologian, but a legal thinker, at kind of high levels who are, and hopefully we would have more of them as women have the capacity and the interest and the affection for the church to do this, but where they're advising, but they aren't because, the priesthood is, we understand, set aside for men. I always explain this to my children as like, yes, men get to be priests and women get to be mothers, and that's a pretty good trade-off as far as I'm concerned. Bearing another eternal soul in your body. And I think for Catholics, and I think for Orthodox too, the sexual difference in fatherhood and motherhood is really important. And so, when I was in graduate school, I went right up to one of my professors who I admired a lot, and I said, why can't women be priests? And he said, because then they would just take over the church and there would be no men left. And so there is a way in which I think that's been true in a lot of mainline Protestant churches, where like women take over and then they all go, and then there's like no church left. I mean, over the course of time. And so for men to have a place in Christianity, which is kind of, has a lot of feminizing qualities, right? Like mercy and these kinds of things, that it's having a model, a father who can lead is a really beautiful thing. I don't know if that's what Timothy was thinking about. I do think that it is important to read all the scripture through the Imago Dei and through that kind of core relationship and core sort of dignity of human beings. So I guess that's all. Yeah. That's what I would say.
There's a chapter in your book, and forgive me, I'm going to read it. It's on my list now, having had the pleasure of listening to you and reading some of your articles. So you deal with one of the chapters of, the distinction, interrelationship between duties and rights. Mm-hmm. There are tendencies in the political environment in the United States and parts of the Roman Catholic Church and political philosophy in general that would say something like, rights are these kind of social contract, progressivist invention. Yeah. They've been a disaster, an unmitigated disaster that ends in this kind of vacuity of freedom. And so we should just dispense with the concept of rights and stick with duties, right? As being somehow more intelligible and stable. Mm-hmm. How would you respond or reconceptualize that challenge? Yeah.
So I have a whole lot of review article that's kind of engaging this question. So I think that those who understand rights as coming only out of social contract theory, which is basically John Locke mainly, and then Mill and all that, I think don't have the understanding that others have been able to pull out of the Christian tradition. So like Catholic social teaching is very deeply informed by an older account that sees kind of human dignity and sort of the, that human beings are kind of inviolable, and and the duties that are owed to human beings, say the duties of the 10 Commandments, like thou shalt not kill, that is like has a correlative of a right to life, right? And thou shalt not steal has a correlative of some sort of property right, right? And so if you understand rights and duties as correlative, which an older tradition, again, there wasn't prior to Locke, there's rights of canon law, things like that within rights, but there's not like a full concept of natural rights before Locke, but you can find it. And that's what the Catholic social tradition has done since then, is saying, no, social contract theory doesn't work because it's based on an incorrect understanding of the human being, which I talked about with the kids a bit today, which is this idea of like the liberal individual who walks along and says, gee, I'm here all alone and I think I'll enter into society with you, which is just like not how we experience ourselves, right? We're always interdependent and in relationship with others. And so because of this idea of the correlativity of rights and duties, you can think of it as I have, if you have a duty to me, then I have kind of a correlative right. But then I have, if I have duties, I have rights to carry out those duties. So you think about that with regard to like religious liberty. Why do I have religious liberties? Because I have a prior duty to worship God. And so therefore I have a right to do so. And so they're both kind of implicit.
Yeah.
And so that's why if you keep them closely connected, then you can have a Christian account.
Yeah.
And so I would disagree with those who would say, like an Alistair McIntyre, who I absolutely adore, I think that he is, and my teacher, Father Fortin, they only concede the social contractarian idea of rights, and because of the way rights have gone so far south,
Right. That's it.
that they don't want to give this other account. But I think we always have to give positive accounts, right?
Yeah.
To replace
this
them.
other question, let's see if I can remember exactly how to formulate. You're familiar with the policy, regarding just abortions in general in the United States. There's a threefold way of describing it. Maybe you can help me. It's basically like safe, rare, and something.
Yeah.
Say that
Yeah.
more. Legal, safe, and rare.
Yeah, that's the Bill
legal,
Clinton.
Safe, legal,
Yeah.
safe, and rare. So
Yeah.
you get this, I'm sure, all the time. And one of the challenges of the sort of pro-life position is always this very controversial moment of sexual assault or rape. And so what do we do in these instances? And this sort of trifecta is one of the things used to say, hey, this is what we would like this to be, to account for that. Is this a morally responsible position? That's what this question is essentially asking, or how do we give a morally responsible response?
I mean, the flippant answer to that would be like, if it's legal the way we have it, it's not going to be rare, right? I mean, because it becomes like a crutch, right? If we actually could have had it be like safe and rare somehow in some, the problem is that right away it becomes like through Roe v. Wade, it like all the, limitations that we had that like doctors were working at in the 1960s and all that, like allowing for abortions in these cases and with permit and all that, really taking seriously like women in serious situations and the, the fact of the, unborn human being who's there. Like that kind of negotiation was happening, and then Roe v. Wade like pulled it all up. And now we had 50 years of living in a culture where it was just assumed that a core right of women was the ability to kind of, imitate what men do in terms of walking away from a child was to take their own life. So it becomes, the way I think around this is to really think about, and this is actually, so I occasionally get invited to say my alma mater, Boston University School of Law, and I went to a reproductive justice class. So if you're taking a reproductive justice class in law school, you must be pretty hardcore about reproductive justice, right? And so there's the class with 25 students, and they invite me in to kind of talk about, like, they want someone who considers self pro-life to come and talk. And so right away, I go not at rights, but at duties, right? And so ask about the questions of duty of care, like what do we owe one another? What do we owe the poor? What do we owe the migrant? What do parents owe their children? And to try to just like push the question of like, does a mother owe her child anything at any point? Does the father owe the mother and the child anything at any point? And to like try to think about the question in that way, I think it's just a much better way of thinking about it, because it's, again, the question that we don't ask enough is like, what do we owe one another? And it's a question that I think people from kind of, except for like far right libertarians who like don't care about anyone, I guess. I shouldn't say that. But they don't think, but like people on the left, like you hear them talking about, kind of, they wouldn't put it like responsibilities maybe, but like concern for the environment, for the poor, for the migrant, like all that, like those are a sense that we owe things to others. And maybe it's that they want the government to do all the work, but there's a sense somehow that there's like, we have kind of, as human beings, we have vulnerabilities and interdependencies, and that something out of that injustice is about our obligations to others. And so that's a question I want to be having. So I didn't really get exactly to your point, is like, what's the moral, with regard to rape, I guess
Yeah.
is the question. So I'm a legal thinker, so like I don't see any universe in any time where we have, a prohibition of abortion in the case of rape. I just don't think, like, in terms of practical wisdom, prudence, that's like on the horizon. I guess in maybe some deep red states that may be the case. I think, people are pushed all the time to like, well, that's not logical or something like that. I mean, I think a lot of law has to do with practical wisdom and prudence, and that like you just can't get to exactly what you want to do, and so you have to make compromises, right? There are incredible speakers who talk about how they were conceived in rape and talk about their lives and their gratitude for their life. There are women who talk about having been raped and then not wanting to kind of undergo like a second kind of violence, have born children who are conceived in rape, and how those children changed their lives and healed them, like enabled them to be healed from rape. So I think there's a great beauty that if a woman is accompanied in that way, she could see that, look, this violence has been done against you, and that there's a child that exists that now is in your body and you are nurturing that child. And so can there be a great good that comes out of this great evil that's come to you? I mean, that's sort of like a moral account of bearing a child out of rape, which I think is like I can't even imagine. It's an incredibly heroic act, but does it compound it, to do something otherwise?
Thank you.
I think just a point on the duties of care. One thing that struck me recently, we don't have to talk about this, is our duties of care to the elderly.
Yeah.
And in our society, that's
right.
in my mind, horrific.
Yeah. Right, there
The
used to be
the
like our
suffering.
wise elders, and then
Well, I mean, like around Pacifica, we have like numerous like assisted living facilities with people just suffering, and nobody knows that they're there. Nobody's paying attention.
Do you ever send the kids in?
We do, but it's. I mean, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do send them in, but it's a different conversation. But the duties of care thing, not only for unborn children, but also for elderly as well. So, and the poor as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm cut off from my resource. It's possible other questions were submitted.
We have one.
Maybe we have
someone.
We can open it up a little bit.
Yeah,
too.
we can open it up. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So if anyone wants to ask
Not
a question,
technology.
I think we're at the stage where we could just open it up.
Technology.
I have I try to always think about root causes and whatnot. And I'm just curious. So, how much of what you talked about, what the various feminist ways responses to problems in the family has occurred in non-Western cultures? So maybe a good comparable would be like Eastern European versus Western European, where it's more similar. And I'm just curious, I just think kind of at a more basic level, you've got kind of in Western Christianity this more justice focus. And when you think about like divorce, both in Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, it's just wrong and you can't get remarried, you're in sin. Versus in the East, in Orthodoxy, you have the number one goal of marriage is theosis. It's unity with Christ. And so they do have an economia for divorce. And I'm just curious if that kind of justice versus theosis focus contributes to kind of downstream some of the things that you talk about, where there's these root causes within Western culture where we've separated in a way from apostolic Christianity. I don't know if I'm
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I don't know a lot about Orthodoxy, so I'm not sure that I can make any comparisons with Orthodoxy. I would say that an account that, say, like, I could say something about Luther's account of marriage versus sort of a Roman Catholic understanding of marriage, but I don't.
That in the same Augustine
Yeah.
tradition in the West.
Yeah.
It's more. Anyway, so I'm just.
So I would say that you're reading Roman Catholicism through Protestantism, is my sense. Because in my understanding of marriage in the Roman Catholic Church, it's very much that there's two who are united in order to help each other get to heaven.
Yeah, but there is not an allowance for divorce.
So there is. You can get divorced in the Catholic Church. Yeah.
But I'm just.
No, you can get divorced you can get divorced you can separate, and then if you need to get divorced, you get divorced. There's a question of whether you can get remarried.
So,
Yeah.
but that
Yeah.
would contribute to one's decisions to whether or not to
Yeah.
engage in that.
Yeah. But there is an understanding of indissolubility at the very outset, absolutely. That is like marriages for life.
I guess I'm trying to like, how much of these are Western problems and what might be contributing to it?
Yeah.
Like when you made the comments about Andrew Tate, I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with you. I wish he wasn't.
Yeah.
But I asked like, well, why are all these people drawn to him?
Yeah.
And you made the comment about like, well, what if we let women be priests and whatnot? And somebody said they would take over the church. Well, hasn't that broadly happened in society with a lot of our cultural institutions?
Yep.
And maybe a lot of those men are home watching porn and
Yeah.
being incels, and that's why they like Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
yeah.
That like, what are these root causes? And to me, that's what really fundamentally needs to be addressed versus, you know, changing a few laws here and there and more, you know,
I agree that we have deep root causes that are
so I'm trying to understand
philosophical.
like how far back do we need to go within the Western tradition
Yeah.
to identify that, and how do we get back on the right path is what
Yeah.
they're saying.
Yeah.
So do women have the same challenges as Western women and American women in some of these other cultures? I don't know as much about them. It doesn't
and I don't
seem
either, so
different
I'm
to
not
me.
sure
And they
that
seem to be
yeah.
more like they maintain that kind of agrarian partnership, even though they still industrial. I mean, they're still
Yeah.
more modern today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway.
I actually don't. It's funny because Marianne Glendon, my mentor, is a comparative, she's a internationally well-known comparatist. So she looks at different kind of constitutional systems. She would be able to tell you way more than I can, but she also is still limited to kind of the West. And so that's just a question that I don't have kind of access to the sort of either observations or data that would enable me to make a judgment either about like the facts on the ground or what the causes would be. So yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would blame the Enlightenment over the West in general, and just an account of the individual that's autonomous and on his own. Before I would blame like all of the West. I mean, I also have issues with Protestant understandings that come not out of Protestantism today, which I don't know a lot about, but just an account of like Luther's account. But that's like a whole nother conversation, So, yeah.
Another question, Trevor. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate this being lecture here. Hi. I've got a daughter who's about to graduate high school. She's in the lecture with you earlier.
Oh, great.
She had a wonderful life.
Oh, good.
I'll be brief. My life is incredible. I married an incredible woman who graduated from UC Berkeley, went into teaching in a public school. When we had kids, she pulled out of public school to homeschool. Kind of
Amazing.
great sacrifice to us as a family. We have 4 kids.
Amazing. Yeah.
When my daughter was about 10 years old, we started getting an influx with good, loving Christian people to give my daughter kind of visions of what it means to be a woman. And she started being given the books. We would come home and she'd have another book from someone in the church about women who were heroes. And one day she came to us and she noticed that none of the heroes in the book she was being given were anything like her mom, right? Because they were all people who had accomplished something in the marketplace. And so we feel as a family, this kind of tension between these competing visions.
Yeah.
You have kind of, one of the ways we've said in our home is after Sheryl Sandberg wrote her book, we said it's a lot of pressure on women to both lean in and lean out at the same time. So as she prepares to go to college, one of your central ideas is that we ought to be giving young men and women visions of what it means to be an excellent human being.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you were, I mean, you have a daughter, I imagine you've got more than one.
I have 4 daughters.
Yeah, you have 4 daughters. So imagine as they are coming to you and asking the question, I'm standing at the precipice of college and the future.
Yeah.
I feel competing visions.
Yeah.
This kind of uprising of a trad white movement looks wholly insufficient.
Yep.
And at the same time, the pressure to feel like I need to somehow be totally independent from everybody else also feels devoid of some meaning and value. What does it look like to be an excellent woman?
Excellent woman rather than excellent human being. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good. That's
yeah,
a good question.
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that makes it easy in my house is because we have so many children and because I have a husband who adores my kind of role, contribution, work as a mother. Like, it's taken for granted in our house that like babies are good, motherhood is awesome, fatherhood is awesome. It's something noble to aspire to. It's something we do together, and it's like the core of our life. So like that, there's not much you have to even say, that we do talk about it all the time. So all three of my daughters are, so the fourth is the 6-year-old. So we're again saying she's really cool, but like we're not talking about her. So the other ones are all older, and one's 23, one's 21, one's 19. And so they're grown, and they're all very, very different. And I think that would be like the core of what I would say, is that I think as a parent is helping them to have, I was actually saying, I think it was to Mary during this amazing time we've had together while I've been here going from event to event, is that the thing that I think, my children are they're really incredible women, and deeply faithful Christians, Catholics, and want to make, contributions to the world. But the thing that I think I've taught them most is how much they need to rely on prayer, and like how I think they've seen how like messy life is and how deeply inadequate like I am as a human being, and that I just have to ask for forgiveness, ask for help from God all the time, and that's what life is all about. And that a lot of life is like just falling down and getting back up, and like relying on others, and working to try to have a vision of what I want to be like, and then kind of stumbling along the way, and then having success, and then not, So I think like all of that is like part of how we've raised them. My husband, I guess, is deeply inadequate too, but I don't see that as much, right? As my own. So they are all really different, and they've, I think, been really free in our family to really like think about what God wants for them in their lives. And so they don't feel the pressure. I mean, it's not to say they don't feel pressures. They do feel pressures, but it is much more guided by like, I'm a woman, that means I have this great capacity to have children. They all want to have children. And I suspect, one of my daughters is like, when do I get to get married? Like, I want to have so many kids. That's my 19-year-old, and has they all have serious boyfriends. And they all kind of like see motherhood as so central that then they're like, okay, how else can I imagine my life? So like this one who's really anxious to get married, and like the capacity she has a personality a lot like mine. She's like a ton of energy, and I could see her having a bunch of kids and being really satisfied, but she also wants to be a therapist, So she can see she's studying kind of literature and philosophy, psychology. She's at Hillsdale, really enjoying it. And is like allowing herself to be formed and prepared so that she could maybe see a way to take that on. One of the things I would say is that I was very much at home when I had I had 6 kids pretty quickly, because my learning curve at motherhood was like this, because I had very few, images, examples. I had them around me because I had a great community around me, but for my own life, it was really, really hard. So like the idea of kind of working and having children at the same time would have been like way too hard for me. So I had a lot of space where I was reading a lot. I would occasionally read an article. And then I did a book that was like, I edited some essays, and I would speak here and there, but it was very much, I was full-time at home. I think other women, like my own children, I could imagine having a different kind of capacity because of the way that they've like had young children around them. They don't have a big learning curve to be a mother, because they've like kind of know about it already, and they love it, So anyway, I'm not going to go through all my kids, but I will say that my oldest daughter I was talking to the students today about Plato's conception of equality, that he saw men and women as each, as like the soul, the kind of professional soul being like in either men or women. And so there's like doctor souls. And so like my daughter has a doctor soul, and that's really the only way of putting it, is that she, like from a very young age, like had a sense that she was supposed to be a doctor, and nothing has taken her off that path. And so she's, studying philosophy right now, and then will be going to med school next year, and has a very serious boyfriend. They're both deeply devout Catholics, and they're gonna watch God how to like bring, figure out how to make it through, I think, united. So I just think like she's unique in the sense that like would I advise, a young woman to go to med school with all of that? People call me and ask me questions about these kinds of things all the time. And it's like, my first question is when they say, should I go to law school? I say, are you dating? First question. How serious are you? So in other words, do you want to take on debt? There's a lot of questions that go into that. And I think those are vocational questions, and we're not really good at that because vocational questions require us to have somebody to help us along, to know us well enough, to ask questions of us that are important, to try to help us know ourselves. And that's something we don't teach. You all teach that, I'm sure, at Pacifica. The school that I'm associated with, Montrose, very much teaches how to have that kind of self-knowledge that enables you to sort of think through those questions so you're not beholden to the culture. You're not thinking about what's right for them or what the excellences that they want to get, which is a lot of money, or on the other end, being fully home and not doing anything else and whatever. But how to blaze your own path with kind of your own talents. And so I guess that's what I would say is that it's having the faith as the core, and then knowing that women and men are different because women have the capacity for motherhood, and it's a really beautiful thing. And then how do you see yourself contributing? What are your dreams? What are your questions? What do you wonder about? Those kind of things. I think helping them really feel free, and knowing that the most, and actually Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In, she said the most important decision a woman makes is who she marries. I didn't read that book, but I absolutely agree with that line. Yeah.
I believe we are out of time. I'm sure there might be a little spilling over of the conversation. I want to just sort of close us out by, first of all, saying thank you. I mean, I've had the privilege of seeing you at USC.
Oh no, 3 times!
Seeing you with our students, seeing you
Poor
here.
thing.
Oh, and it's just drinking from the fountain. It's the good stuff. It's a joy. It's a joy to see faces. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. And so hopefully everyone in this room
Alex,
is here.
Before you go, lead us home. Tell us your role real quick. So
Who are you?
Who's this guy over
Who
here?
is this man
I'm just
with
some
the
guy
beard?
who walked in off the street in a dress. I thought, my name is Father Alexander Earl. I've been at Pacifica for a good while now, since 2016, and was a faculty member. I taught theology and philosophy, and I left to go be a priest. And so now I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, but I have the just exceeding privilege of coming back to Pacifica and still being involved in our Philosophy and Theology Center for Philosophy and Theology, which I had a hand in developing our curricula and just sort of the vision and the mission, everything that we're seeing here today, which I'm just very grateful for. So you might see me twice a year, God willing. It's an exceeding privilege, and now I don't know what my title is. I'm like a senior fellow or something like this. It's the title they give to a guy who's not around very much, but at least important enough to have sometimes. So again, grateful to be here, and part of what made me fall in love with Pacifica and still does, and so it's easy to repeat, is just this mission, this vision, this motto of thinking and living well, of which even the Pacifica Center for Philosophy and Theology, really this idea of bringing together what's being torn apart, is that thinking and living well is very challenging today, right? The many things are being broken apart, and I think this conversation is a key one to see our students come to you after the seminar just hungry for those kinds of answers, hungry to have someone speak with authority, quite frankly, in a way that reassured them that the disaster that they're navigating has answers. And I think just to try to summarize everything that I've seen the last few days is that, this idea of feminism, which deals with this problem of sexual asymmetry, as you've so greatly put it. Second and third wave feminism, the way we've experienced it now, essentially says we're going to deal with that asymmetry by technology. We're going to say, we're going to control reproductivity, the pill, abortion, whatever. But what I take you as doing is essentially saying, whoa. That seems to be a denial of women. This is I love what you said, male normativity. And this can't be the answer. And instead, the answer, as you've so well challenged us, is something to do with excellence, something to do with virtue, something to do with the Imago Dei we see, and which really just say something to do with Christ. And that really in Christ and in Christianity has always been the real feminism that has always championed women and liberated women. That's not to say it hasn't failed, but that is at the core of its vision. that Christianity is true freedom for everybody. So I always want to conclude with something something I hope is appropriate, which is something from Aristotle, which I have had such a joy seeing you here the last few days. I'm grateful for your wisdom, abstractly to take us through the philosophy, through Plato, through Aristotle, but also through the history, through all these thinkers who I know nothing about, quite frankly, and to take that and to apply it to a topic that's quite controversial and difficult to navigate because it's heated. And therefore, I thank you for your prudence to take that abstract knowledge and prudentially navigate it for us and tell us, how does this all bear on our own moment? I thank you for your moderation and tone, to see you in dialogue yesterday at USC, to give both to a high school student and to a room of all of us weirdos, to take the same thing and apply it in different ways is a form, I would say, of moderation, if anything but speech, of courage, to say things that are uncomfortable, to do things that people, again, are uncomfortable to talk about because it can poke people, right? It can challenge in good ways. It can affirm in bad ways. And it does take great courage to get in front of crowds of people you have no clue where these people are coming from, and say what you believe to be the truth and is the product of your research. And finally, of justice, to give what is due to women, right? To speak about women's rights, to speak about the imago Dei in women, but also to men, that we're all called to be human in Christ. And so I believe that your work really is searching for justice. And so whatever Aristotle's faults, I want to thank you for bearing Aristotle's virtues. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a journal that I'm the editor-in-chief of, Fair Disputation. So if you're interested in kind of like this new idea of feminism, there's a whole bunch of other women who think about this in kind of a way that I do. We have different sort of research areas, but you may have heard probably Louise Perry's probably our most famous featured author. I don't know if you've heard of her, Mary Harrington. Anyway, there's a whole bunch. So Fair Disputations is a great way.
Should we
You can
pass those
go.
around?
Yeah, sure. Anybody who's interested, do I have more in the car? I don't know, I may have more. So there aren't enough for everybody, but there is a QR code, and there's essays every Friday.
So thank you, Erika, so much for spending time with us.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank
Yeah.
you, Bob and Leslie. And thank you all. I think the cool thing about what we're trying to do at Pacifica is we're just trying to set the table, right? There's no way this conversation can be fulfilled in one evening. So our goal is to charitably talk about these topics in an ongoing way, right? So let's continue to do that. Let's also build friendships too as well. One of the things that Pacifica is known for is the community and building friendships. And some of that's just being fun, and some of it's being serious and thoughtful too. So let's keep doing that, spend a little more time. Thank you, Bob and Leslie, so much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, David. By the way, we were remiss, we didn't talk about our partnership with USC. So this evening and this week was a co-production, so to speak, with USC, Nova Forum, and Pacifica. So thank you, David, for doing that. I appreciate it. If you want to know more about what they're doing at USC, David's here to talk about that as well. So.
Amazing.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Yeah.